I'm Jess Flanigan from the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and I'm here with Dr. Wendy Chung, who's a clinical molecular geneticist at Columbia University. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thrilled to be here.
We're really looking forward to your talk tonight about the future of medicine and genetics. And today, I was just going to ask you a few questions about your work more generally and your thoughts on science leadership, and the ethics and leadership dimensions of genetics in medicine.
Great.
So my first question is, what are your thoughts on the role of leadership within science? I know that a lot of people who develop careers in medicine or careers in science as researchers, they don't have a lot of leadership training or leadership perspectives. What are the important lessons that you think that people should seek out, and how should they learn that to develop leadership skills within sciences?
Sure. So you are absolutely right that the curriculum, either in terms of graduate school or medical school, they don't teach you anything really in terms of any of those skill sets, in terms of being a leader or how to run an organization or even how to run your lab or a clinical practice, anything like that. So unfortunately, we do this kind of on our own by trial and error, and it's a real tragedy because there are a lot of people who, they're incredibly bright, they're incredibly talented, but they make freshman mistakes, right? Because it's not like we went to business school, it's not like we actually got immersed in this. So I do think the good thing is people naturally they're very bright and talented, and so a lot of those people in science and medicine are able to just do it on the fly, because they learn these skills along the way, and they've got generally good people skills, at least in medicine, because obviously we're dealing with a lot of people. Right. But I think the biggest thing is that as you're doing this, to have good mentors, and so it kind of starts with that in terms of learning by example, by imitation. Hopefully, as you're doing this with a mentor, being able to ask them tips in terms of, what are the faux pas? And I think it's really important because a lot more of science, and especially biomedical science, is no longer individuals doing this work. It's very large groups of people coming together. And in terms of setting direction for which way to go, it really takes people that are both smart, but also people that are able to communicate well and really able to take a stand and to be able to not do things that are, in any way jeopardizing health or any way risky. You need to know those boundaries, but you also need to be able to prioritize and decide what directions things can go and what opportunities there are ahead. So it's a part, being able to have the vision and then also being able to communicate that well and being effective.
You've definitely developed as a leader in your field. As your career was developing, what was the biggest challenge that you faced as a leader within the sciences?
Yeah. So I think in my particular era, and I'll just give you a little background within this. So, when I entered combined medical graduate school in 1990, and that was the year the Human Genome Project was announced. And so
Perfect.
It's no coincidence that I, in fact, decided to go into this field, because my very first year in medical school, a lot of my professors were sitting there moaning and saying, like, what is this Manhattan Project of genetics? Like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. NIH and the government is wasting all of this money that's never going to amount to anything. And, when I was trying to decide what to do with my life, and I still, and for anyone who's watching this, especially the students, I'll give this advice, you have to look ahead. Don't look at where we are now, look at where we are going to be. And the biggest opportunity to really have an impact is to be at that cutting edge, right? In terms of setting the direction, being one of those pioneers going into something new. And so as I was doing it, that was the exciting part of things. The part about this that's hard, though, is to prognosticate exactly when things are going to happen. And so in my field in particular, that's been one of the real problems, I would say, among scientists, is being able to, get the energy and the excitement around human genetics and genomics, but really overpromising in certain cases. And so, I think people, because they were trying to advocate for their own science and, in a selfish way to a certain extent, but also in a way to educate the public, it was a little bit of a hyperbole in terms of, once we once we sequence the human genome, once we know what it is, like, boom, we're just going to be able to fix everything like that. It's going to be this immediate one day to the next day. And that really, if you're thoughtful about that, is completely preposterous. But yet, it set these unrealistic expectations from the public in terms of, well, we sequenced the human genome, Bill Clinton announced it, we're done. Like, where's all the improvements in health?
Why is there still cancer?
Yeah. Exactly. And so with that, it's taken really some rethinking in terms of, okay, so what are the steps? That was step one. And now it's really the beginning of the end. It's not the end, it's just the beginning of being able to get to that end. And so I think that's been the hardest part, is being able to think about very carefully, what are those steps, how long do they take, what are the enablers to be able to do all of that. But as you're communicating, and as I'll be doing tonight even, it's being able to set realistic expectations and not trying to make it sound like we've got everything figured out, because clearly we don't.
So one of the new frontiers right now that a lot of people are talking about is CRISPR, right?
That's right.
How do you think that going forward the scientific community should manage that? Right. So some people are saying, shut it down, especially on human research, until we understand it better. Other people are saying, the longer we wait, the longer it's going to take for this to translate into beneficial research.
Sure.
So the earlier the better, right?
Sure.
Every year lost is a life lost. And so how would you balance those types of concerns for this kind of frontier new technology?
Right. So I have to say, I am personally incredibly excited about the CRISPR technology. I mean, many of us have thought about gene editing in some format, but it's always been incredibly difficult, expensive, what we call, having off-target effects. In other words, not being able to surgically go in and fix just the one thing, but really screwing up other things at the same time. So, in terms of when we think about gene therapy and gene editing, this is truly a quantum leap forward. And so that in and of itself is incredibly exciting for us, either simply as a scientific tool or even, as you're suggesting, once we get to therapeutics. I do think it's important that as we do this, it's got to be done responsibly. So my own personal take in this is, I don't think this is something you should be doing in terms of something that's transmissible to the next generation. So in other words, I don't think you should be doing this on embryos, sort of futzing with embryos, trying to fix genes within embryos. And I personally draw the line in terms of trying to improve a genetic deficiency or a genetic problem that's there, but not using it for enhancement. So in other words, I don't think this is at all a tool that should be used to be able to create a better human or a better breed of dog or anything like that. I do think and I spend a lot of my time doing this, there's a lot of human suffering out there. I mean, there are a lot of patients out there, individuals out there that really, really are, as you suggested, dying from conditions that we now know what they are. We know to a large extent why it is that they cause the problems they do. And if there really were a way of surgically going in and fixing that problem, I mean, if this were your kid, if this were your sister, I mean, you wouldn't want to wait another day at all for this. I do think, though, that it has to, as I said, be done responsibly. So as we're thinking about doing that, I think it has to be done first in animals to be able to make sure that it's done correctly, and that we do know what if there are off-target consequences long term, if this is something that these cells that have the gene editing really are sustained, whether or not they die, whether they continue to last, whether this is good for all parts of the body. Maybe it works for liver conditions, but maybe it doesn't work so well for brain conditions, or maybe it's hard to be able to get to, once those cells are in there, to be able to get them to live for the life of that patient. So I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, but I do have great promise. And when I think about the number of patients that I personally take care of that have genetic disorders, and of course I'm a geneticist, so I have a lot of them, there is no single platform or modality that would transform their lives than this type of gene editing technology. So it's incredibly exciting. It needs to be done responsibly. In real terms, I don't see that we're going to be doing first in human studies for this, for another 3 to 5 years. It's not going to be next year that we're doing it. But I really hope that it is sometime within that 5-year window. Would be amazing to be able to see that.
That's great. That's sooner than I would have thought. That's so exciting.
I hope.
I'm glad you brought up the distinction between treatment and enhancement, because tomorrow we're having a colloquium here at the Jobson School about disability and human enhancement. Some people think you actually shouldn't draw a line between treatment and enhancement. If the goal is to promote well-being, we should just think of it all as a continuum and anything we can do to promote well-being. So I was wondering, why do you think that there should be a distinction between treatment and enhancement?
So I think part of this goes back to what you were talking about originally in terms of disability. And so I'm very careful because there are lots of genetic differences, and I'll use the term very specifically, differences that we see. And I think a lot of this is in the eye of the beholder, even in terms of what's a disease, versus what's just a difference, and what are the things that are really impactful or burdensome. And I really think that what's most important is the perspective of the person who's living that life. So number one is, I don't necessarily think all of these genetic differences that some people might call diseases. I actually think in particular when it comes to certain neurological differences, individuals that have these are unique and amazingly wonderful, right? I mean, I don't think they're necessarily disabilities. I do think they're differences in terms of the way the brain works. But on the other hand, it's by having that diversity that we have amongst us gives us, just as a community, so much more insight into and ability to solve problems because you have people looking at the same thing in very, very different ways. So I don't necessarily think we should all be monolithic and we should all have exactly the same skills or abilities. I mean, number one, it would be boring. But number two is we're just so much richer as a community, as a society, because we have that diversity. So that's the first thing I'll say. Within that, though, I do think that you can try and be too smart. And that's what I worry about. Trying to create the perfect human and whatever your idea of what that perfect human is, I really worry that we're not as smart as we think they are. When it comes to, for instance, to me, it's sort of the cost and the benefits of this. If I have a child that I know that without some treatment is going to die before they hit their first birthday, I really need to do everything I can to try and save that child's life, and I don't have that much time to be able to do it. If I'm talking the difference for someone between whether or not their IQ is going to be 110 versus 105, that's something that I can live without, right? I mean, the stakes are not as high as we're talking about that. And to me, there's a much greater potential to do harm within that situation. And as trained as a doctor, one of my first rules is do no harm. And I really worry about that in terms of what's the upside, what's the downside. I'm not willing to make that risk if I could potentially really do some harm.
So your view is something about kind of balancing the urgency of more pressing claims and against also the risks of potentially.
Exactly.
I see. Another sort of balancing question that I wanted to ask you about relates to, you were a plaintiff on the Myriad case, which I think was rightly decided. So I'm so happy that that case went through. But I'm curious more generally about what your view is about patents in medicine. So this might seem like kind of an out there question, so you can totally, but if you were to think about designing a system of intellectual property for medical technology and drugs that could balance access against innovation.
Right.
What do you think would be a good model more generally? Do you think that the patent system for other medical technologies is basically working? Do you like a kind of prize model?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that kind of balance?
Yeah, so I have to say, number one, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a patent lawyer, and I'm sure people that are much more thoughtful have thought about this much more than I have. I think, let me contrast the two situations. So when we're talking about gene patents, to me that really is a product of nature. In other words, your genes were not, something, even if we discovered them in the laboratory, we certainly didn't invent them. And the idea that every individual shouldn't be able to essentially own their own genes and learn the information that's embedded within their own DNA, to me, is preposterous. So
Absolutely, I totally agree.
Right. So, to me, that's kind of a no-brainer in terms of thinking about that. It's interesting that the Supreme Court, though, if you look very carefully at their decision, they did say that it wasn't, genes for information content were not patentable. However, if you start modifying genes, if you start doing something so that from a therapeutic point of view, you could get something. So in other words, if you think not about the gene, but the protein product that comes out of that, or even some manipulation of the gene that's used therapeutically, that they still decided was in bounds. And I think it goes to the heart of the question that you're asking. So the problem is you're trying to balance both the incentives, right, for people to make the investments for those innovations that are going to move us forward in terms of therapies and innovation. So being able to have some way of allowing someone to have a prize, right, for you to incentivize them from doing that, versus, I mean, realistically, some of the therapies that I know are out there, are $100,000, $200,000 a year. A single dose of medication to cure hepatitis, incredibly important, but for $50,000 to $100,000 a year, incredibly expensive. And when we think about access, right, that's the thing that then becomes painful. I mean, I have to say, in my own laboratory, one of my research scientists, her mother had hepatitis. She literally sold her house to be able to get her mother that medication that she needed. So, I mean, it is absolutely real in terms of this. The thing that I think is difficult for me to figure out the business side of this is I do think you need gene patents, or not, rather, I shouldn't say gene patents, scratch that one. You need patents, you need a way of incentivizing companies, individuals to do that research and development. Because, just to give you an example, to take one drug to market, a really robust drug, not just for rare disorders, oftentimes you are talking about literally tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to be able to do that. So this is no joke in terms of the investment that's necessary for that. On the other hand, when we're talking about this, I think we also need to think about, how long should those patents run? I certainly think 7 years, when you look at the life of the patent, is not totally unreasonable. But when you start talking about longer periods of time, that's when I think it becomes questionable about, is that really the right balance in terms of what you need? But like I said, within this, it is clearly a big investment that individuals make in terms of their lives, their careers, companies make in terms of investing this, and there has to be some way of being able to get a payback from this. Otherwise, to be honest, people wouldn't bother.
Yeah, such a tricky question, but that was a very insightful answer. My last question is that for our students, so the Jepson School is starting this science leadership program that partners the leadership studies school with departments like biology, chemistry. And one of the great things is that we're able to bring people like you in and they can see these great role models. What advice would you have for undergraduates in the sciences that are thinking about pursuing a career and they would like to sort of model their careers off of you and your colleagues?
Yeah.
What do you wish that you would have known? What would you like to leave them with?
Well, so the one thing that I was just very fortunate, I think, is that number one is you have to do something you love doing, right? So whatever you're going to be a leader in, you just have to really love what you're doing. Otherwise, it's just not worth it. I mean, if you're going to really be one of those leaders, you're undoubtedly going to spend countless years in terms of training and being expert in this and really toiling at this. So make sure it's something that you love and you feel passionate about, something that you want to get up every day and do. So that's the first rule. And it takes many, many different people and different types of people to do that. So be true to yourself in terms of who you really are. There's no one personality type or leadership style that's necessarily going to work in that. But as you do that, I want to go back to the idea that I had of mentors, because mentors, I think, to me, are some of the most important parts of this. And I think when I grew up, I thought, you had one mentor. You had one person who trained you and, sort of, took you in and, literally showed you the ropes on all of this. I think the more that I realize how complex now our society and how we solve problems is, it's much more matrixed. It's not, like you were just a blacksmith and you learned literally how to make horseshoes and, there's one skill set in that. So I think the solution within this is that you have multiple mentors. You have people that are teaching you different skills and different aspects of things. And as you're doing it, to me, one of the most critical factors these days is to be able to work collaboratively, but also not to be afraid to be able to do something new and innovative. To realize that every one of those ideas is not going to be a home run, but you've got to be brave enough to put yourself out there and to try it. And not to be able to say, if you make one mistake, it's your career and you're over. But to be able to say, you know what, if you're successful, even in many cases 10% of the time, but that success is a real true success, your career, your life has been a success. So, it's about putting those ideas out there, getting a lot of feedback, a lot of people, sort of gnawing on some of those ideas, taking them, forward to a certain way to see which one of those are going to fly, but throwing enough things out there that you do have something that really is going to be big and innovative and impactful.
It's like a true scientist, just experimenting.
That's right.
Experiment
with your life.
With your life in the same way. I like it. That's great advice. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me.